Hello, welcome to the conversation here on News Central Television. This is the program where we bring you all the latest updates when it comes to politics and happenings on the continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa. Today on the program, we will be looking at Tanzanian opposition leader Freeman Mbowe's release from prison. And the United Nations General Assembly vote shows Africa's divisions on the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, Tanzanian prosecutors have dropped terrorism charges against opposition leader Freeman Mbowe and 3 others who were released on Friday after being held for 8 months. Tanzanian police arrested the 4 last year in the port city of Mwanza, where Freeman Mbowe was set to address a meeting to discuss constitutional reforms. Supporters of Mbowe's CHADEMA party and others who were following the case cheered and sang solidarity songs outside the High Court's Division of Corruption and Economic Sabotage. Mbowe and his colleagues were set to appear in court on Friday after a court decision 2 weeks ago that the 4 defendants had to face terrorism charges. Peter Kibatala, head of Mbowe's defense team, said he was happy to see his client released. Now, joining us to discuss this and more is the Vice Chairman of CHADEMA, the largest opposition party in Tanzania. He's been living in exile in Belgium since 2008 and was CHADEMA's presidential candidate in the 2020 general elections. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Tundu Lissu.
Thank you so much, Gbenga, for having me on your program.
We're happy to have you. Now, Tundu Lissu, how did you react to the release of Freeman Mbowe after 7 months in prison? What emotions did you go through? And was this expected?
Obviously, Gbenga, I am very pleased by the fact that Freeman is finally a free man. We for the past 8 months, we have called for his unconditional release. It has taken 8 long months, but finally it has been done, and we are very pleased. I personally, I was overwhelmed to see him come out. To say that I did not expect it would not be entirely correct, because as you may remember, I had a meeting with the president when she was in Brussels to attend the AU-EU summit last month. And I had a conversation, a good conversation with her, and I pleaded with her to see to it that my national chairman is released unconditionally. And she promised that she would see to it that this happens. And therefore, the fact that it has happened, it has not come as a total surprise to me.
Now, following your meeting in Brussels, let's go back to that EU-Africa summit when Excellency it was quite emotional to see pictures of you both, because I recall the last time we spoke, you said she was the only serving government official that visited you in hospital before you left the continent to Europe. How was the meeting, and what transpired between you both?
Thank you very much. It was overwhelming. It was overwhelming because for someone who survived an assassination attempt ordered by the former President Magufuli, to be visited in hospital by the vice president, and now, after 4 years living in exile, to be visited and to meet the president herself, the new president, it was quite overwhelming. It was very emotional, and not just to me, but to everyone who has been involved with these issues in Tanzania for the past 5 years. It was quite heavy, and we broke a lot of ice that day. I think that the fact that Mr. Mbowe has been released these past 2 days has a lot to do with the fact that we had that first meeting in Brussels last month.
Now, I did remember asking you this question, that the man who you refer to as your tormentor-in-chief is no longer with us today. So are you willing to let bygones be bygones? And your answer was an emphatic no. What has happened after all this months? And you meeting Excellency President Suluhu Hassan definitely has, I'm sure it was one of the things you discussed. Where is the case against those who try to end your life? What's the current situation?
Well, definitely, it was one of the issues that I raised with her. And I asked her to see to it that the perpetrators of that heinous act are brought to book. Trying to kill a political leader is, under our law, a terrorism act, a terrorist act, actually. It's one of the most serious criminal offenses under our law. And I was gunned down in broad daylight in a heavily guarded government housing compound. And now I know, and she knows, that it was ordered by her predecessor. Now, Mr. Magufuli is long dead now. It's going to be a year in about 10 days since he departed. And I think the new president will have the opportunity and the courage to reopen this case, to ask her security officials to properly investigate and bring to book all those who participated in the dastardly attack on me that September afternoon in 2017.
Now, Ms. Lissu, the charges that were brought against Tundu Lissu, there were heavy charges bordering on terrorism and bordering on terrorism
against Mr. Mbowe.
Yes, on Mr. Mbowe, I beg your pardon, yeah. Bordering on terrorism, quite heavy, and treason. And these charges were brought when Madam Suluhu Hassan became president. A lot of people thought that after the passing of John Magufuli, that Tanzania was going to, become more democratic, and there'll be more space for civil society and opposition voices to flourish. But this wasn't the case after we saw charges brought against Mr. Freeman Mbowe. Why were these charges brought in the first place?
Well, that's a great question, Gbenga. I'm not going to try and defend President Samia Suluhu Hassan for wrongfully and completely, without any foundation, without any basis, bringing these charges against Mr. Mbowe. The charges were, we knew from day one, we knew that these charges were completely bogus. There was absolutely no foundation to them. We knew that they were politically motivated. They were intended to silence Mr. Mbowe in his campaign to bring a new constitution for Tanzania. So the charges were brought purely on the basis of political motive to silence the voices calling for constitutional reform. And we said so from day one. And it took 8 months for the president to understand that the course that she had taken was disastrous to her credibility. It was disastrous to her effort to get the world to welcome Tanzania back to its bosom. And I must say, therefore, that one can only understand why these charges were brought by perhaps understanding the fact that when President Suluhu Hassan became president, she inherited the entire government machinery and the personnel of her predecessor. So she had to deal with the Magufulistas in her government, and they were everywhere. And therefore, there were things which were common during the reign of President Magufuli, which continued under her watch out of sheer inertia. But I must say, in her honor, she realized, even after 8 long months, that this is not the way to go, and she's changing course. And I think that is a very good thing.
Quite a positive sign it did. Now, when President Samia Suluhu Hassan took power a year ago after the late President John Pombe Magufuli died, it was hoped that she would break from her predecessor's authoritarian approach. But Mr. Mbowe's arrest seemed to dash those hopes. Now, he's been released from prison, and it's been... Do you think this is a sign, following his release from prison, that the opposition will be allowed to operate more freely, or is it too early to call? And I must mention that you said... I also want to ask you if it's almost 1 year in office for President Suluhu Hassan. Has she been able to win herself off the influence of the Magufulistas, as you put it?
Thank you very much. I would say, I think, fairly, that releasing Mr. Mbowe from prison, meeting him, inviting him to a meeting in the State House, meeting me in Brussels last month, and all these steps that she has taken are very positive steps in building the confidence of the democratic opposition that after 6 bloody years, maybe we are now opening a new chapter for our country. It is a very important gesture on her part, but it is only a gesture. A lot remains to be done. Magufulism was not just a case of government acting illegally and with complete impunity. It was also a government enacting repressive laws. It was also a government behaving in ways which are completely inconsistent with international norms and inconsistent with our constitutional and legal norms. Now, the greater task that needs to be done now is to create the legal, constitutional, and institutional conditions which will see to it that these things do not happen again. It is not sufficient to release opposition leaders who should never have been imprisoned in the first place. It is much more important. It is much more important to remove the conditions which allow a sitting president or any of her officials to imprison people purely because they disagree with them politically. And therefore, the most important thing that we must do now, and that the president must do in order to win that credibility from the international community and to win the confidence of her people, is to embark on a quest for constitutional, legal, and institutional reform, which will make sure that we do not depend on personal whims of whoever is in power, but we depend on what the law says.
Now, talking about constitutional review, Excellency, President Samia Suluhu Hassan has said that, that's not a priority for now. A priority is reviving the Tanzanian economy, and talks about the constitutional review and changing the constitution has always been a contentious issue when it comes to Tanzania. What type of reforms are you advocating for? And where does the current constitution lack in fulfilling the yearnings and aspirations of ordinary Tanzanians?
You see, Gbenga, the constitution of Tanzania as it is today is fundamentally a constitution that was drafted, that was enacted under one-party rule in 1977 at the height of one-party authoritarianism in our country. It is in its fundamental, it is in its essential features, a one-party constitution. 30 years ago, a presidential commission of inquiry, which was appointed by President Mwinyi and which ushered in multi-party system for Tanzania, recommended that the most important change that needed to be done in order to build a democratic multi-party system was to enact a new constitution based on the new ethos of multi-party democracy. Now, that was never done. So we are talking of something that should have been done 30 years ago. Magufulism, this autocratic and dictatorial exercise of power, was made possible by the strictures of the current constitution and our current constitutional and political order. If the president wishes to build a strong economy, she must start by building a stronger democracy. An autocracy, leading a country as her own personal fiefdom, will not attract the investors that she wishes to see coming to invest in Tanzania. That will not, certainly will not build the economy that she claims to want to build for Tanzania. And this argument that we don't need a good constitution now, we need to build our economy, is 60 years old. It is an old lie that has been completely discredited by our history. In 1962, when we became a republic, President Mwalimu Nyerere then refused to introduce the Bill of Rights as part of our new constitution then, on the ground that we needed to develop and develop fast. Yes. And the human rights would hold us back. But a quarter century later, Mwalimu realized that without human rights, there is no development. And therefore, for the current president to tell us that we don't need a democratic constitution because we need to build a better economy is a kind of, is a 60-year-old lie, as they have said. It is simply not acceptable.
Now, Mr. Lissu, what's your party, CHADEMA's party's approach to achieving this constitutional review? What's because it's quite a difficult process, and you need to have a majority of parliamentarians before it's quite cumbersome. So how do you plan to go about it? And are there members of the current ruling party that also see the need to change the constitution?
Gbenga, the fact that we don't have a single member of parliament in the current parliament is no bar for us getting a new constitution. As you may remember, when the ANC was unbanned, the ANC of South Africa was unbanned in 1990-91, and then South Africa embarked on the new democratic constitution making under CODESA. They did not have a single member of parliament. That did not prevent the people of South Africa from getting a democratic constitution. We don't need to have a single member of parliament to be able to enact a new constitution for our country. What we need is to build the kind of mass movement. What we need to see happen is to build a coalition of broad sections of the Tanzanian population, bringing together all sectors of society to demand constitutional change. If we can do that, we will have a new constitution.
Now let's talk about your party and the opposition in Tanzania. Just a few weeks ago, you met with Her Excellency President Samia Suluhu Hassan in Brussels. You embraced and, spoke about things. It was quite an emotional scene. And following the release of Freeman Mbowe from jail after 7 months in detention, he did sit down with President Samia Suluhu Hassan. So it seems everything is going quite well. So is there still a future for the opposition? Some will say, you know, I mean, what's the point of having an opposition since you've made peace with those that wronged you in the first place? What's the future of the opposition in your party, in your country?
As I said, Gbenga, what the president did by releasing Mr. Mbowe is only a gesture. The bigger task lies ahead. The bigger task lies in the future. We need to build a democratic society. A democratic society requires a democratic constitution. And therefore, what lies ahead for us is the much tougher, the much more difficult task of making sure that we build a coalition, a national coalition, supported by our international friends and other people of goodwill, to push the current government to agree to what is obvious, that Tanzania needs a new constitutional order to catapult the country into the 21st century. Therefore, we have a lot on our hands, Mr. Aborowa. We have a lot of stuff on our hands. And the fact that Mr. Mbowe is free is only one small step in the long road ahead. I agree with you entirely. It will be very difficult, but we have never been frightened by difficulties before. They will not frighten us now.
Now, Mr. Lissu, to the million-dollar question, I'm sure you've been expecting this, and a lot of people must have asked you in the recent past. It's your 4th year in exile in Belgium, and like we always say in Africa, there's no place like home. So when do you plan to return to Tanzania? And are the conditions right for your return?
Gbenga, that's a very good question and very provocative one. I put it to the president when I met her last month. When am I coming home? And she said, you just come. No one prevents you from coming, from returning home. And I told you know, Madam President, you know the circumstances under which I left. You, more than any other government official, you are the only one, the only person who came to see me in Nairobi. You know what happened to me personally, not by being told by somebody else. Now, those who did that to me and those who sent them to do that are still at large. And therefore, even though I believe you are a good person, I believe you mean no harm to me, I think I will feel very safe if you make a public statement that Mr. Lissu, please come home, you will be safe. And if you say that, I'll be on the next plane from Brussels to Tanzania. So that is my answer, Gbenga.
Okay.
I'm waiting for the president to invite me home. And if and when she does that, and I hope not before too long, when she does that, I will be on the way home. I miss Tanzania more than anything else.
I can imagine. No place like home. I'd like to say a very big thank you to you, Mr. Tundu Lissu, for taking time to join us on the conversation today. I wish you all the best in your endeavors, and we look forward to having you back on the motherland.
Thank you so much, brother. Thank you so much for having me on your program. And next time it should be somewhere in Lagos, not
okay. Fantastic.
Not
We look forward to hosting you, Mr. Lissu.
Thank you.
You're watching The Conversation on News Central Television. We'll go on a quick break. When we return, we will be talking about what transpired at the United Nations General Assembly last week. 12 African nations decided to abstained from voting for the resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We'll give you more details when we return. Join us again. You're welcome back to the conversation. Earlier in the first half of the show, we did talk about the release of opposition leader in Tanzania, Freeman Mbowe. My guest was exiled opposition leader Tundu. He joined in from Belgium. Now it's time for us to switch gears into something different. Just last week, 12 African nations, 17 African nations, I beg your pardon, abstained from voting for the condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that's what we're discussing on the second half. Now, the General Assembly passed a resolution on the war in Ukraine on March the 2nd, 2022, in which the vote overwhelmingly supported a call for Russia to withdraw from the country. But the voting revealed significant differences amongst African countries at the body. 17 countries from the continent abstained. 27 countries voted for the resolution, and one, which is Eritrea, voted against the resolution. The vote at the Assembly's first emergency session since 1997 was 141 to 5, with 35 abstentions. Most Western nations voted against Russia, and were joined by Nigeria and Kenya, along with 25 other countries on the continent. South Africa's decision to abstain has been criticized inside the country. In the BRICS alliance, of which South Africa is a member, China and India also abstained, while Brazil supported the resolution. Ethiopia was among the African countries that were not present, but Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has issued a statement calling on all parties to exercise restraint in the crisis. Now, joining me on the conversation this evening is Gustavo de Carvalho, a public policy analyst, joins in live from Pretoria, South Africa. Thanks for joining us on the program, Gustavo.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Gustavo, how do you react to the 17 abstentions? That's quite a high number from African countries at the just concluded United Nations General Assembly vote condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And why did so many of them decide to abstain?
Thank you so much. And I think when we talk about 17 countries that have abstained, we have also to include another 8 countries that were not in the room during the voting, which effectively brings the number up to 26 African member states that either abstained, did not vote, or voted against, which shows a very fractured space in terms of a united African voice within the United Nations. We have seen already in the past years more and more discussions within the UN when it comes to peace and security measures that have been fractured, but it certainly shows that particularly from Southern Africa and the Sahel and the East and the Horn of Africa, showing a much more inclination towards not condemning the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but also showcasing a type of a narrative that focuses more on the dialogue between the parties as a key prerequisite for peace in the region. Certainly the continent will be, the eyes are on the continent now. In a situation like that, it's much harder for countries to not take a position or being on the fence, like we see in the case of Southern Africa and South Africa in particular, that it has been putting statements out that are somehow against the war, but not necessarily putting a very strong position against it.
Now, why do you think some of the countries were absent? What reasons do they give for being absent, not the ones that decided to be neutral?
There is a number of reasons, and I think the question of neutrality that you present is quite important. I think in a situation like this, it's very hard to be seen as neutral. In situations where there's so much divide within the United Nations, there is a tendency for nuances to be a lot of times disregarded. But a lot of the official statements, like we've seen in South Africa and by a lot of SADC member countries, and also some of the countries in East Africa, show to this idea of the importance of negotiation and mediation. But we also seen that many of these countries are countries that have historical ties with Russia. We have to be aware of the fact that Russia has been placing a very important role in the continent for the last decades, and that it's difficult for many of these countries to actually avoid that, whether it's in terms of historical relations, in terms of trade, in terms of arms deals that are very common, but also the facts that we see Russia playing a role in Africa, that it's purely and clearly geopolitical. While many of the Western countries tend to portray their position within the continent under the developmental lenses and so on, Russia is not quite shy in showcasing that their interest in the continent is geopolitical. But there is one other point that I think is important for many, and particularly here in Southern Africa, is also that we still have the memories from 2011 and the votes of Resolution 1973 that imposed a no-fly zone in Libya, where many African member states were criticized by effectively voting in favor of what became a regime change. And it actually becomes, from a public opinion, very hard for some of them to actually be able to put a strong position considering the patterns of the past.
Now, Gustavo, Eritrea has oftentimes been described as the North Korea of Africa, and they were the only country that voted against this resolution at the United Nations General Assembly. Why do you think they did?
Especially for countries like Eritrea that already have fairly fractured relationships with the international community, voting against the resolution does not really change much of the status quo. I think much more important at this stage, more than the one country that voted against, is the 17 countries that abstained and the 8 countries that did not show up to vote, which does actually show a much more confusing positioning, and it's very hard to know whether they're in favor or against of the language of the resolution, like we saw with the explanation of votes in South Africa, or if it's indeed they are trying to not position themselves either supporting the West or Russia in that case.
Yeah. Now, what's the significance of these votes at the United Nations General Assembly, as it was a non-binding vote? Why is it important?
It is a very important voting because within the United Nations Charter, you have one of the mechanisms within the Charter is to what do you do when one of the permanent members is seen as blocking a particular situation. And it's quite rare that the Security Council would actually put that situation into vote for the General Assembly. So despite not having a binding and not being legally binding like UN Security Council resolutions, it does have a very important symbol and mechanism to showcase that the international community is behind a particular cause. And in this case, we had a large majority of the United Nations member states voting in favor of the resolution. So it certainly provides a symbolism that it's important for the international community, and it does create a degree of expectations of what the international community should be doing to support halting and reducing the conflicts in the region.
Okay, thank you, Gustavo. I'd like to introduce our second guest on this segment, Dr. Wurayayi Zembe. He's the president of the Democratic Party of Zimbabwe. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Zembe.
Thank you very much. I greet you this evening in Zimbabwe, the New Central TV Africa. And I also want to greet my fellow panelists here on this conversation.
We're happy to have you, Dr. Zembe.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Dr. Zembe, your country, Zimbabwe, was one of those 17 African countries that abstained in voting for the resolution to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Why did Zimbabwe take that position? Has there been any explanation from your foreign ministry or government?
Well, I'm sitting from the terraces in Zimbabwe as far as that decision is concerned. It was made by the Zimbabwe government, which is run by the ZANU-PF as a political party, and they made that decision. There has been any referendum in the country to get the people's decision. So this is the tradition in the UN business. Countries are represented by governments, and those governments make decisions as they see fit. I can only, in fact, assume that the current government may have made the decision because of the bilateral relations that are there between Russia and the Zimbabwe government as represented by the CPF government, because the history during the liberation war in Zimbabwe from 1963 to 1980, when we gained independence from the British, the two parties that organized armies fight colonialism in Zimbabwe, fight for independence, were operated by political parties that had relations with Russia, Soviet Union, and also with Asian countries. So when a government formed, that relationship was formed up to today. There is also business relationships between the government of Zimbabwe and Russian government, and that have led to the Zimbabwe government from staying, making it that it's not possible that we made a decision. Whatever considerations they made, I don't know, because I am in control movement in Zimbabwe, in the democratic struggle that they are persecuting the people.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Zembe. Now back to you, Gustavo. Quite a number of the countries that abstained are countries that are heavily dependent on aid from the West. Could there be consequences from abstaining which might be seen as tacit approval for Russia, as we've analyzed earlier?
Absolutely. I think in a situation like this, it's not just a matter of principle for member states that are voting in a particular way. And as I mentioned earlier, the fact that there is such a divided UN Security Council and such a divided General Assembly, it will become very hard for countries to defend any kind of neutrality within the situation. And certainly we are already seeing a lot of pressure from Western countries pushing for what those countries that are so-called on the fence right now to actually make a stronger position about the situation, which may generate another type of, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it's to the likes of the Cold War, but certainly a heightening of a division of positions that it's very hard to be neutral or a third party in a situation like that. So we should expect more pressure from Western countries. We should expect also more pressure from countries like Russia. And sadly, I think a continent like Africa will be the weakest link on that situation, which would have to make some difficult decisions in terms of which side are we on.
Quick ones, Gustavo, before I go to Dr. Zembe. The vote at the United Nations General Assembly only became a first in 40 years when the General Assembly has sat and passed a resolution to reprimand members' aggression. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is definitely not the first. If you've been following geopolitics in the last 40 years, do you sense double standards here? Because a lot of people have said, look, the poster boy for violating United Nations resolutions, and they have the world record on that, is Israel, and nobody bats an eyelid when it comes to Israel's aggression and violating United Nations resolutions. And there's also the case of the United States and NATO's involvement in Libya. So what do you have to say about this?
There's certainly a double standard in a lot of the discussions, and I think it's part of the nature of international politics to some degree. For those of us that have been following discussions within the UN Security Council, is a frustration that we've had for decades when we see how little geopolitical importance some of the permanent members give to issues in Africa, while it's something like this in Ukraine really changing a lot of the global dynamics and global relationships. But that is to say that this is part of international politics. It's a sad part, but it is part of this politics. And to some degree, I think the division within the African continent is actually quite sad, because considering that individually African member states have far less power than the rest of the international community. When African member states are able to vote together on issues, and we've seen that numerous times in the last 10 years, it provides the continent a much stronger voice. The sad part, I think, with this division within the African member states is that it makes the individual positions much weaker, and it becomes much harder then to actually showcase their own interests around what is the role of the United Nations in conflict settings. That is to say, I still think that the African Union, and I see the image of the African Union now, of the United Nations, and particularly the African member states, to actually come together and to be able to provide a common African position that it actually provides that space for stronger African voice. As we stand, we are spectators in a situation, and sadly, that division makes our voice even weaker when it comes to that. But going back to your first question, there's certainly a double standards, and sadly that it's part of current global politics, which we can't sadly avoid.
Thank you, Gustavo. Now, Dr. Zembe, you did hear Gustavo. He says, we are stronger when we vote as one bloc. And the African Union is not only divided on this issue, the vote had to be postponed till next year following Israel's admission as an observer nation into the African Union. So as we speak now, the African Union is quite divided. Now, my question to you, Dr. Zembe, is this. Do African nations traditionally vote as a bloc in the United Nations or vote as individual nations? How can we reach a consensus like the early days of the Organization of African Unity when there was a lot of Pan-Africanism and lots of members agreed on so many things?
Historically, from my observation, I am yet to witness a situation where total resolution was made, the UN, where African countries acted in unison together. I think, historically, we can see that the African continent is a battleground for the fight that again is the fight against racial domination, the fight against colonialism. And the fight is yet to be finished actually in Africa, because after the so-called independence, many African countries witnessed initially continuation of the domination by former colonizers in the activity of many African countries, although they dominated in a subtle way, actually working with post-independence governments. At the same time, we witnessed upheaval in many African countries as the Africans, the populations of Africans fought for the democratization which didn't end at independence, but which had to be translated from most of negotiated settlements, even where there's been a war, a bitter war for that matter. In Zimbabwe, there was a bitter war, which was for 15 years. But after that struggle, the colonial governments were actually replaced by African governments, continued with the oppression of their citizens, which meant that those governments again had to be in opposition to the former colonial masters and countries that backed the colonial governments in pre-independence Africa. So we are still a background as Africa for really the discovery of true independence, the true democracy in African countries.
Okay.
And that happens, there continues to be differences among Africans in terms of how they should behave at the United Nations. We are all observing that the United Nations, 945, about 7 years now, we are witnessing a situation where the Security Council, the member of the Security Council, has started aggression against an independent, autonomous country. We have seen the Russians taking, and that is violating actually the cardinal principle and the reason why the United Nations was established was to avoid the similar occasions like they had during the Second World War. But now, the 5 countries that are members of the Security Council, my observation, are really repositories of real fear of the United Nations to stop terrible war, to stop aggression, to stop invasions.
Thank you, thank you, Dr. Zembe. Thank you, Dr. Zembe, for your submission. Just before we go, I'd like to direct this question to Gustavo. Many have called for the reforms, for reforming the United Nations, saying it's undemocratic, especially the Security Council. And I believe South Africa is leading the charge for an African permanent membership of the United Nations, because they were formed in 1945 from the League of Nations to prevent wars from happening, and we've had a series of serious wars since 1945. What are your thoughts on reformation of the United Nations? Or what form of reforms would you advocate for, Gustavo?
Thank you so much. And I think certainly the situation in Ukraine will bring to us a space in which discussions around, is the United Nations fit for purpose of dealing with situations of peace and security? And I think a lot of countries like Brazil, like India, like South Africa, Nigeria, all have this claim that it's a correct claim in terms of, is the United Nations now responding to the global dynamics as it was in 1945 when the United Nations was created? And certainly those discussions should gain a bit of momentum in the last couple of years. The big question is that will it gain enough momentum that we would get again into a serious discussion around reforms like we had in 2005 to 2006? At this stage, I think sadly not. I think a lot of the members, the permanent members, and if there is one thing that brings the P5 or Russia, the UK, China, the United States, and France, that brings them together is precisely their unwillingness to actually have a serious discussion around UN reforms. So the key players here for us to talk about is not only having the West to decide that, but particularly the 2 countries that have more heavily opposed to the reforms, that is China and Russia. I do think that developing nations and countries of middle-income countries like Brazil, like Mexico, like South Africa, like Nigeria, like Turkey, Indonesia, and so on, should continue with some of these discussions and bring this back to the table, because if they don't do, there is no indication that the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council will do that at their own willingness. And it's something to considerably think beyond just what modalities and who should have those seats and what type of reform we want, but at least an understanding that a serious reform process should be on the way. And we should do that as part of the Global South that will be mostly affected by the inability that the UN has right now to conduct serious reforms of its structure.
Gentlemen, I'd like to say a very big thank you to you both, Dr. Wurayayi Zembe, President of Democratic Party Zimbabwe, and Gustavo de Carvalho, a public policy analyst from Pretoria, South Africa. I do appreciate your insights and time. Thanks for joining us on the program. Okay, that's it on this edition of The Conversation. In the first part, we did speak to Mr. Tundu Lissu, opposition leader in exile of Tanzania, on the release of Mr. Freeman Mbowe from prison. And we just ended our conversation on the 17 African countries that abstained from the United Nations General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is where we draw the curtains on today's show. I'm Gbenga Aborowa. Until next time on The Conversation. Bye-bye.